Well, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where in the world you're watching it. My name is Paul LaBarish, and I'm a technical evangelist with Microsoft Canada. What that basically means is that I'm a resource that Microsoft Canada provides to folks like yourselves to understand our platforms, specifically things such as Windows Phone, as we're going to talk about, or not talk about, but we're going to talk about mobility in general. But Windows Phone is one of the areas that I'm really passionate about myself. So can somebody just confirm on the chat window that you can hear me? Because I don't know for sure, and I just want to make sure I'm not talking to somebody and it's all blank. So anybody just ask. All right, good. Glad to hear it. Okay. You never know when you're talking about live casting stuff. So anyways, here we go. So let's do this. So again, thank you very much for joining us. The idea behind this presentation is the lessons that you're going to learn from this are such that you can actually make use of these various tips and tricks that I'm going to give you, regardless of which mobile platform you're targeting. So obviously, Windows Phone is near and dear to my heart as a Microsoft employee, as you might imagine. But equally relevant in this presentation are the learnings that you can use for Android development, iOS development, and pretty much any other mobile platform out there, including BlackBerry. So without further ado, let's start this presentation. So there's three things that I want to talk about here today. One is the basic principles of mobile application design. So there's a few things that every single mobile application or mobile app out there that's any good anyways from an experience standpoint will have. And we're going to go through some of those things to make sure that you're familiar with them and how you can implement those within your projects today. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a mobile application great. So what are the things that you can do to raise the bar on the experience and the quality and the value of your app to the users that you're trying to target, right? So it's not just good enough to put something out there and hope it sticks, right? You need to do something to differentiate yourself. So we're going to talk a little bit about what makes those mobile apps great. And then finally, ideas being the currency of awesomeness. And I love the ending of this presentation because it's sort of inspirational in a way, but it also provides you with some really interesting ideas as to how you can sort of think up new ideas for mobile applications today. So let's go through this. So let's go through the primer first. You may be familiar with this book. It's Tapworthy, as you can see by the screenshot of it right here. This is one of the best books on mobile app design that I've ever seen. It's an amazing book. I have it on my bookshelf, and it's talking about iPhone apps, obviously, and certainly Josh Clark is very passionate about the iOS platform, and it's great to see. And he is a really great writer and gives some great ideas in this book. And it's one, like I said, it's on my bookshelf all the time because it's actually very relevant to all sorts of different mobile platforms. So if you're not an iOS developer, you still might want to take a look at this book in the bookstore to see if you can find some learnings and stuff like that. And like I said, it's on my bookshelf. I use it all the time. But there's something that he talks about in this book that I think is very prescient to what we're talking about here today, and that's basically three motivations. So every single user of a mobile application is trying to do at least one of these three things, right? So you're microtasking, so you're trying to do work in the white spaces in between your normal day job or between going to a soccer game for your kids, or maybe you're just in an elevator just doing something. So microtasking is doing those very short tasks that you can get done, within half a minute or something like that, and then move on to something bigger that you might have to do. The other one is being about local, and local is really about being, finding out what's around you. So mobile phones have GPS devices, or at least most of them do, the smartphones anyways, and they provide you with a great amount of information that you can make use of from a local perspective. And then the third one is the I'm bored factor. So when you're using your mobile phone, chances are you're taking a look at it because you're bored about something. So whether that's you're on Twitter, or whether it's you're trying Angry Birds or something like that. So let's dive a little bit into each of those three principles anyways. So as I said before, microtasking is all about short bursts of activity. So you could be writing an email, for example. That could be something that you're trying to do. Idea capture, as you can see here, is an example of microtasking as well, where you're sort of jotting down notes about certain things. So you could be using a note-taking application that provides you with a way to sort of type in notes, or maybe even using your voice to record audio and things like that. So these are ways that you can actually do microtasking. It's also things such as, playing a game, for example. That could be a microtasking type of thing, but that fits more in the I'm bored category. So the second one is the I'm local, right? So I talked about the fact that GPS devices today have many different sort of capabilities. Everything from, like I said, the GPS, a really great camera. We could be talking about accelerometers and compasses or gyroscopes, if you will, those types of things. The mobile platform today, the mobile smartphones out there today, regardless of what platform you're on, are amazing, amazing things. They do an awful lot of really interesting things that you can take advantage of. So locality is one of the main things. So, you take a look at Foursquare, you take a look at Groupon, you take a look at all these things. These are applications or services that allow you to take advantage of things that are near you, right? So most of the application developers that I talk to think about how they can be local, or how they can add GPS sort of capabilities, or the ability to find out where you are as part of their app. Now this one's a little bit different than the microtasking one, and it's a little bit different than the board one, which we'll talk about in a second as well, because of the fact that you're dealing with situations where it's actually not every single application will have a scenario where using the GPS makes sense. So just bear that in mind, and we'll move on to the next one. And this one's the I'm bored, right? Think about it. Games account for basically the majority of apps within app stores, marketplaces, whatever you want to call them. It's usually around a 60-40 split. So games, 60% of the app store and 40% for regular non-game apps. It's certainly true of the marketplace for Windows Phone, and I believe it's very true of the App Store as well. There's a reason why there's a majority of games on mobile platforms. Mobile platforms are great for social games, or for casual games, I think is probably a better way to put it. The intent around a mobile game is not to be something that's like you're building Skyrim or something like that on the phone, although that would kind of be an interesting thing to try. But really it's about the casual game space, right? So Angry Birds, play a few levels, you're in and out, you could be done within a minute, you could be done within 5 minutes, doesn't really matter. It's really interesting how, the games allow you to do something to, fill the boredom, the white spaces in between the days. So you're waiting for the bus. If you have a smartphone on you, you're probably going to play with the game or something like that. Or you could be checking your Twitter posts or posting something very quickly and things like that. It's all about curing the boredom, I guess you could say. And it's really important to keep these three factors in mind: the microtasking, the local, and the bored. If your application or game does not solve one of these three motivations, I suggest you really take a look at what your app really does, right? And be critical about this, self-critical. Think about what your application is really trying to do, because ultimately, if it doesn't fit into one of these categories or more than one of these categories, you could end up with a situation where users may download your app but never use it again. So it's something just to keep in mind. Now let's also state the obvious. The phone is not the desktop. And this is something that, everybody says, well, obviously, it doesn't make any sense to say anything else otherwise. But, step back for a second and really think about what this means. Especially if you're trying to build an application for a mobile platform that has legacy on the desktop, like a rich client application or even a web-based application, it can get kind of tricky here, right? So it's not just the question of the black and white issue of desktop or mobile. If you're actually trying to port an application to the mobile platform that was on the desktop or a PC or something of that nature, you really, really have to think hard and fast about what exactly you're trying to transfer over to that mobile platform. It's really not something that you can do and really think about where everything that's on the functionality of your desktop application to the phone. And again, that's also obvious. But when you actually go through the process of driving the functionality and figuring out exactly what the experience is for that application on the phone, you have to be very careful about resisting the temptation to actually bring that functionality or all of it onto the phone. Because some of it may not make sense. Some of it may make sense in certain situations, but you have to rationalize that functionality. It's really, really important. And PC versus mobile, it's kind of like oil and water in a lot of ways, right? As I said before, if you're just building down a scaled version of your desktop or web-based app, you're doing it wrong, right? And you're missing a lot of the nuances that the mobile platform is. And I think it's also very important to really understand that a mobile application is not just a subset of a PC-based or web-based application. Really, really important to think about that. It's very possible that there's capabilities on the phone that you might be taking use of that don't exist within your desktop or web-based application as well. So just be aware of that, right? So if you think about things, this is what maybe a desktop app looks like, right? So this is kind of the extreme version. You've probably seen this this example on the phone or on the web, I should say, before. This is probably about as ugly as it gets. I will admit that. But it does bring up a point, right? There is the funny point, which everybody probably got a chuckle out of, but also there's the point around desktop applications, PC applications can do an awful lot, right? You can do an awful lot of things all at once. Mobile applications, obviously, kind of very different. You're very focused on a single task. That's important to realize. So let's take a look at what a mobile application or a mobile experience looks like. We as designers, we as developers, we as publishers of mobile applications think that this is what you consider a mobile experience. Kind of makes sense, right? Yeah, you're looking at icons, or in that case Windows Phone here, tiles. You could be looking at an application. Yeah, it makes sense. You're holding it, the phone in your hand. That makes sense. But this is really, think about this. This is really what a mobile experience is. You're very much on the go as a user, right? You should not be texting and driving. You should not be doing anything while driving on the phone. Just be aware of that. I'm not advocating this, but this is something that you see, right? You can see people using their phones, walking down the street and hitting a lamppost or something like that. I have seen that twice, in fact, and I've actually seen one of my friends hit the glass of a building while he was on his phone as well. So that was actually quite funny. But that sort of brings to the point here, right? Mobile experiences are on the go. They're not still. There's movement involved and everything else like that. So you have to be aware of the fact that even if you wanted to port everything from a PC app, or even if you're building a new app altogether, resist the urge to put too much on a single screen. Really important to understand that. Simple is always better when we're talking about mobile applications from an experience standpoint. So around that, let's think about this. This is the application we're thinking of building. You're probably taking a look at this going, okay, this is a cockpit of an airplane. Okay, yeah, it's really, really complicated, right? So, you have your phone, you have all these dials and switches and everything else like that. Yeah, you can fly a plane with it, but if this was an interactive screen, if you're trying to deal with the throttle or anything else like that, actually touching that would be very, very difficult. Getting in a button, figuring out the gyroscope for the land level and all that kind of stuff, really tough to tell, right? So this is an application that could be a flight simulator, for example, right? Very complicated. Probably you'd want to rethink about how you're building this application on the phone, because this is going to turn off your users and they'll never come back to it again because it's too complicated. So I bring to you a rationalization of this concept and actually bringing it to this. What does the plane do? It takes off and it lands, hopefully safely on both cases, right? So the whole point around this is really rationalize down what is possible with the application or with the phone, and really sort of figure out exactly what the basic use cases of your application are and use that for the screen. Like I said, you don't have to build an airplane cockpit for your application. In fact, if you do that, you're probably getting it wrong in the first place, because your users may think it's the best thing because there's so much in there and it's like a beautiful piece of work that you built because it's got all this functionality. But let's face it, if the user doesn't like what you're using, you've ultimately failed for that user. And if all your users basically open your app once and then never come back to it again, all that work is for naught because obviously they're never using your app again. So keep that in mind. This is something that's very, very important. So let's also take a look at the way applications are built for the phone. And let's start by taking, again, a look at a PC-based app. So this is Microsoft OneNote, which is an amazing note-taking application, part of Microsoft Office, or if you go to office.live.com, you can even try it online yourself if you want. And let's take a look at this around the concept of a mullet. And if you're not familiar with what a mullet is, you can check it up on Wikipedia, but basically it's short hair on the front and long hair on the back. And if you were a hockey player in the 80s, specifically if you're a competitive hockey player in the 80s, you probably sported a mullet yourself because that was all the rage, right? So Jeremy Roenick is probably a great example of that back in the early 90s, late 80s or something like that. So if you're familiar with hockey players, it's pretty funny. But the idea was, a mullet is business on the front because it's short, and then there's a party on the back because it's all long and everything else like that. Well, if you take a look at a typical PC-based application, and again, it could be a Mac-based application or a Windows-based application or a Linux-based application. It doesn't matter, right? They all sort of follow the same format, where the business is on the front, which is basically your control windows, right? Your controls, in this case, a ribbon. And then the parties at the back are on the bottom where the actual content is. This is a paradigm that you consistently see on basically most every single PC or web-based application today. And the reason for that is it works, right? So you can focus in on the content that's right in front of you, and you can use your mouse to actually click on various different things in the menu which don't get in the way of everything, and it's all good, right? If you tried to do something like this on a mobile platform, it becomes a bit of a problem. So most apps are actually the reverse of this, right? So if you take a look, the party, the content, is in the middle again, but also on the top, right? And the business, the controls, are on the bottom. Now this isn't by mistake, and it's, as you can see, the iPhone does this, Windows Phone does this, any mobile platform out there today will do this, and there's a good reason for this. It's easier to make use of on the phone and everything else like that. But if you think about it, it's got to do with your fingers and your thumb. So let's take a look at this. You take a look at the orange zones that you see right here. This is basically where your thumb area can actually take a look at things, right? So that's a touchable area without reaching too far for your thumb. So if you think about it, if you put the menus on top, it requires you to change the stance of how you're using the phone, right? So therefore, if you put the menus at the bottom, you're off to the races, and it's a much better sort of situation. So it's something very, very important to keep in mind. But there's also another good reason why. Let's take a look at Foursquare, and I'll explain a little bit why this is an issue. So just as a background, Foursquare, when they first came out with their app for Windows Phone 7, this was one of the screens that looked like. So it's nice, if you're into the Metro design style, this probably is something that you go, yeah, I get this. This is kind of cool, right? You have your pivots for details, your pivots for people, and everything else like that, so you can go left and right and everything. And it's a very clean interface. So you say, okay, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Like, what's wrong with this? Well, you may have already gathered this, but let's take a look. When you try to check in, your finger goes there, and there's a problem with that. And the reason for that problem is the fact that you end up with a situation where your hand gets in the way of actually seeing everything else on the screen. Now, this is a little bit of an extreme example, but this is basically why you don't see menus at the top. And also, why you should not be putting controls that are majorly used by that screen at the top as well. Put them at the bottom, because if you put them at the bottom, your thumb doesn't get in your way, your fingers don't get in your way, and you can still read the content of the page. So here's a simple fix, right? So if you remember, the check-in screen was at the top. Let's just bring the check-in screen and we'll put it down at the bottom. So again, that makes it a lot easier. But this is something that, as interesting as this is probably not where you want to end up. This is not the ideal sort of implementation for a screen like this as well. You probably want to think about this a little harder. And the reason why is we have something called Fitts law. Fitts law, this monstrous equation that we're not going to get into, it's something that you can take a look at and say, okay, well, I'm not really into math right now, or if you're like me and you've been out of university mathematics for years, this is probably something that's going to scare the hell out of you. But basically, this is what it means. Fitts law translated means the bigger and closer a target it is, the easier it is to hit. Makes sense, right? So the whole idea behind this is that make your controls on your screen appropriate for what needs to be done. So let's take a look at the screen again. Well, actually, let's do this first. So here's an example of this. So there's some guidelines that iOS developers are given by Apple around the minimum size for a button, for example. So 44 pixels, which is the equivalent of 7 millimeters, is the minimum size of an control on the screen that is interactive with the finger for you to use. And likewise, you can see that's a little bit different for Windows Phone, but the whole idea is generally the same, right? So the reason for this is because your finger is not like a mouse. A mouse has a very finite pixel focus, and you can actually get right down to a specific pixel fairly easily on the screen. But if you're using your fingers, you have sort of a wide swath of where you're actually able to touch. And if you're like me and you have a situation where you have a mobile control that you're trying to tap on that's very, very small, it becomes a big issue, right? So in order to do that, you should make use of things like grids. And if you take a look at the idea behind Windows Phone, there's something called a magic number. And the magic number is 12 in this case. And I'm not going to get into this. I wrote a blog post about this. And when these decks are available, I'll make sure that the blog post is available to you as well so you can take a look at it. But basically, every single mobile application platform has a magic number. So in the case of Windows Phone, it's 12. So you have a 12 by 20 grid, for example, in the case of most Windows Phone applications. And you should use the grid and superimpose the grid when you're actually building out your screens, because it allows you to sort of identify areas where you can put your controls and do it in a sort of a consistent manner and everything else like that. Very important. It actually helps make your application much, much better. And again, this is true of any other platform as well. So getting back to the Foursquare, we have the original, right, where the check-in box was at the top, and then we moved it down to the bottom. But we did something a little bit different here as well to introduce the concepts of Fitts law as well. So the map, as you can see, is much bigger, right? Because really that's the main visual component of this screen. So you want to give as much screen real estate to that visual component as possible. So in this case I cheated, I just stretched the map from the image already, but you get the idea, right? But we also did something around the buttons, as you can tell. So the check-in screen that you see here is much, much bigger and it's on the bottom. Now the reason for that is the visual component should take up the most area of the screen, but the controls that are used the most on that screen should also be given a wide amount of screen real estate as well. In this case, checking in is a big deal. You don't want users have to sort of aim their finger to try and actually hit the check-in. Ultimately, the whole idea behind Foursquare is get to the place you want to get to, open up the app, check in. Done, right? Hopefully you become mayor in the process. But that's not all as well. You can take a look here. The get directions and call buttons are actually quite larger too, right? So we've stretched them across the screen. And that makes it easier for them to actually be hit as well. So these were what I would call secondary controls. Check-in is the main control. The map is the main visual, and then your secondary controls are getting directions and then calling the establishment that you're checking into, for example, those types of things. Now, I did this presentation before, and I think actually one of the people here actually was there and made a suggestion during that, and I'm actually I like this suggestion quite a bit. So instead of actually making the get directions and call buttons a big line across, what we do instead is you can actually make them into sort of fatter rectangles. So get directions on the left-hand side and then call on the right-hand side, but they take up the wide amount of the screen. So again, it makes it easier for you to actually make it possible for you to hit those application buttons much easier as well. So this, by just making a few changes in the orientation of these controls, you've made this screen much, much more usable and a much more immersive experience. So it's kind of an interesting thing. All right, what makes mobile applications great? And this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about these things, right? So as I said before, Windows Phone is kind of my deal. That's what I'm focused on at Microsoft. But I will be the first one to tell you that if you're building a Windows Phone application first, for example, and it's all nice and it looks great in the Metro design style and everything else like that, I would suggest very, very carefully to think very carefully before you translated or you ported that application to, say, for example, Android or to iOS and use the same Metro design style. And the reason for that is, first of all, cloning is boring, right? You don't want your app to look the same in every single platform because you want users to be able to have a connection with it. And one of the reasons why users have a connection with a specific app is that it actually feels part of the whole experience, right? So every mobile platform has what you would call a personality. So the personality or the paradigm for Windows Phone is Metro. On iOS, it's sort of the glass buttons and the sort of rounded corners and everything else like that. If you're building an iOS app, make sure that you use the same sort of design paradigms that the native OS actually uses. If you're doing it for Windows Phone, make sure you use Metro because that is the native paradigm that is being used by the phone. And the reason why that's important is because if you think about the experience that you're giving your user, the best thing that a user can compliment you as a publisher, designer, or developer of an application is to say that I didn't even know this app was an app. I actually thought it was part of the OS. Now, mind you, they knew they downloaded the app, but the whole idea here is to make it feel like it's an extension of the operating system. It's native. It's rich. It follows the lines, curves, and personality of the operating system that you're actually targeting. It's very important to do that. And if you don't do that, so say, for example, you have a Metro-based application that you've built for iOS, that can actually be a bit of a jarring experience, right? So it's actually something that you need to keep in mind. Sorry, just a little bit of transition there. So this is kind of what I was talking about, right? So staying within the paradigm of the platform, making sure that you do whatever you can to make sure that the user experience is consistent with the operating system itself. So every platform has this unique flavor and style, which we talked about. There's a consistency there. That consistency breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds a likability to your app and everything else like that. I think it's important. And it's also important to realize that predictability is not a dirty word here. So you want your user interface to be intuitive. You don't want it to be something that users are going to look at and go, well, I don't know how to check in to this spot, right? Because it's 3 screens in or something like that, and it just doesn't make any sense. The more intuitive your application is, the better off you'll be, because your applications will be able to be downloaded, and then people will come back to it all the time. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the reason why it's interesting, the reason why I have the picture of a hand, like skeletal hand here, is one of the things that, for example, I think every single modern platform out there has what we call ergonomic engineers associated with it. So Apple brought in ergonomic and industrial design engineers and things like that to mold and modify, create the iOS sort of experience. Likewise, for Metro and everything else like that, Microsoft brought Windows Phone ergonomic engineers and things like that for that as well. And one of the things that I think are common between all these different platforms and things like that is they take a look at the human condition and the human body for cues on how to build a really successful sort of application. So, for example, what Microsoft did was they took a look at the hand, and they said, if you played with Windows Phone before, you'll notice that there's a lot of left to right sort of scrolling rather than up and down, although you can do up and down in Windows Phone as well. The reason for that is not just to be different for difference sake. We did it with a specific reason in mind. If you take a look at the anatomy of the hand, it's a lot easier to do this, move from left to right with your thumb, than it is to go up and down. Now, it's a small, very subtle thing, but it is something that we decided to take advantage of. And if you use a Windows Phone for a long time, it's very difficult to go back to another platform because you're very used to the whole idea of the left to right scrolling, which is kind of interesting. A little bit of tidbit of information there. Now let's get into the whole idea around application function bars. So the stuff that's at the bottom of the screen. I think it's really important to take a look at how great applications are built in, things like that. So in the case of a GPS sort of based application, so in this case it's the Metro app for London's metro stations and everything else like that on iOS, you'll notice that the map takes up the whole space, and then there's some things at the top, but the main functionality is basically at the bottom of the app bars, right? So for main tasks, use the on-screen control. So what is the main thing that you need to do? So for example, Foursquare, the check-in button, make that a control on the screen itself, because that's where users are going to look at it the most. For secondary tasks, like for example the get directions and the call example on the Foursquare app, you may actually want to put those in the app bar because they're used quite a bit, but not nearly as much as the check-in button. And therefore you actually free up a little bit of screen real estate if you need it as well. And then if you need something that's rarer in functionality, but you do want to keep it on the screen, use that as a secondary menu. So an example of this would be Windows Phone. If you take a look at the app bar, there's an ellipsis. An ellipsis is basically the ... If you tap on that, you'll actually see a secondary menu pop up. So it doesn't take any screen real estate until you actually tap on the ellipsis, and then you get that secondary sort of information. So an example of that would be a settings functionality for the application. Maybe you put that in the secondary screen because chances are users are going to set the settings for the application that they want and then not come back to it for a while. So keep that in mind. How are we doing for time? Okay. Gestures, I'm not going to get into this too much, but it's basically package confusion, for lack of a better term. The main thing to realize here is that, we in this audience are more than likely very technology oriented. So we like to dabble with things. We'll try things that we can think of, like shaking or throwing, maybe not throwing your phone, but using jarring motions, things like that from an accelerometer standpoint, whatever it is, right? Those types of things. We tend to do those types of things. You need to realize that your user base, unless you're building an application that is specifically focused on very technophile type people, you're going to be in a situation where you have an application that, some users may not understand the gestures needed as shortcuts and everything else like that. And also the main thing to realize is that many gestures are kind of difficult to use in one-handed scenarios. The shaking is something obviously you can do, but if you need to do something with, like this pinch and zoom would be an example of that and things. My suggestion to you is, unless it's very obvious that you can use a gesture to do something, avoid it, because that is something that your users will have to take some time to figure out and see if it works better for your app and things like that. And as a result, they might get frustrated and not come back to your app. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't implement them at all. It shouldn't be implemented as a primary thing. And you need to be the judge of how you implement gestures within your applications, but it is something you need to be aware of. Examples here of things that make a lot of sense, right? So the Etch-a-Sketch app on iOS, obviously, experience informs gestures. So this is an area where obviously the shake gesture for an Etch-a-Sketch makes perfect sense. Everybody had an Etch-a-Sketch or probably seen an Etch-a-Sketch when they were growing up. Maybe some of you have one now. You never know. But the whole idea here is that, everybody knows that, to clear the screen, you just shake it, right? Because of the magnetic files and stuff like that, or the filings for iron filings for magnets. Within the original physical Etch-a-Sketch, that can be transformed to an experience on the phone as well. Likewise, you take a look at the compass here on Windows Phone. You know how to use a compass already, right? So you go back and forth and you can do things. People know how to, arrange the phone and everything else like that. So that's something that's very easy. And then the other thing would be, for example, here, using multi-touch on the Android app here for the guitar. So being able to strike a chord. So if you're a guitarist and you want to do E minor, which is basically using these two fingers here on the second top and third top on the first fret, you kind of know that already if you're a guitarist. You can do that and then you strum, right? So these are gestures that are obvious. That's when it makes sense to use a gesture. But if you're doing something that's a little bit unnatural, keep that in mind as well. And this sort of falls in line with what I call paving the cow paths. So cow paths, or this is a map of Boston, and I love Boston. I don't know if any of you have actually been there. Probably a few of you have. It's one of the most amazing cities to be in. It's a fantastic city. But if you take a look at the map of it, as you can see right here, there's very few straight lines, right? And the title of this slide probably gave it away, but the reason why there's no straight lines in this is because A, Boston is a very old city, B, it was a settling city that was based on farming communities and everything else like that, and C, what was the thing that farming communities did? A lot of them were dairy farmers, they had cows, so basically the cows would actually create the paths that they would go on, and that actually molded how the city looks, which is kind of interesting, right? So the idea is, instead of Boston, when concrete cars started coming to fruition, they didn't do something around reshaping the entire city. They decided to make use of the cow paths that were there, the dirt roads and everything else like that, because it just made sense, right? So what that means from a mobile standpoint is try to do things that are intuitive that the user is going to do. So what are the various different navigation scenarios that you have in mind? Do you think that the user will get that right away without having to read a help file or a help screen or anything else like that? Watch out for unsuccessful gesture attempts. So like if you're doing a focus group on your user base and everything else like that, if a user's shaking the phone trying to do something and it's not doing something, take advantage of that and take a look at what that means, right? So ask the user, why were you doing that? What was your motivation behind doing that? What did you think would happen? Those types of things, right? So the other thing is repetitive time-consuming actions and stuff like that. So filling out forms and stuff like that, just be careful about that. Try to find a better way to do that. Mobile applications are not meant to be data or input intensive. That's just not the nature of the form factor. What you want to do is you want to make sure that those applications do make sense for the user in the scenario that they're using them, which is basically a mobility scenario. So making users awesome in the moment, and I think this is perfect timing. All right. Let's remember the three motivations that we have here. We have multitasking, your local, and your board. At least one of those three things is what your app should actually try to accomplish. The ideal is that your application hopefully solves two of these things. Now, all three, like I said, local may or may not make sense depending on the scenario of what your application is trying to do. But if you're building an application for the mobile platform, multitasking and board, if you can solve those two things, you've got a winner probably, because users will come back to your application, right? There's a guy by the name of Tomi Ahonen, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, but he basically said that there were originally 6 mass medias, and then you can see print, sound recordings, da-da-da-da-da. So he's sort of a guy that sort of takes a look at trends within media and what the various different channels are that people actually get their content. And he actually added to the 6 mediums, he actually added mobile. And I think that's very telling. He knows what he's talking about, not just on the mobile side, but the other ones. But I think it's very telling to show that mobility is becoming the norm. So I think there's, I forget the stat, and I could be very wrong on this, so don't quote me on it, but there is a statistic that's saying that I think there's going to be 3 times as many mobile phones in North America as compared to PCs by the time 2015 comes. That's a lot of mobile phones. And the majority of those are probably going to be smartphones, especially in North America. Mobility is becoming the norm for the way people consume information. And I think it's really important for you as a developer, designer, publisher to take advantage of that and really understand that. Build an application that's immersive, but also informational, right? You want your application to provide information to your users so that they can make decisions, right? Or make something that keeps them from getting bored, like the Angry Birds phenomenon. There's a reason why they're so popular and why they're making billions now. It's because they hooked onto an idea that wasn't necessarily groundbreaking, but they did it in a way that made people want to come back to it because it's fun, right? It solves the boredom factor. It also means personal, right? Everybody has their own personal tastes, and I think it's really important for you as publishers to understand exactly what that means for your application, right? How do you make your application a personal extension of your user, right? So what will make your user come to your application versus another application on the mobile phone and everything else like that? try to figure out that value proposition, because it's really important for you to grab hold of that, because there's a stat out there that says only 26% of mobile applications downloaded by users, and this is across all mobile phones, ever get open more than once. I mean, that is an incredibly tough market, right? So you could have what you think is the best app, but only 1 in 4 users will actually think that that's an app that they're going to open up more than once. Now, if you build an awesome app, obviously that goes up. Angry Birds is a good example of that. Twitter applications, if they're built right, are great examples of that. Try to make it so that your application becomes something important and personal to the user, and then they'll come back to your application. The other thing is it's something that I'm fairly on board with, but basically I don't think there's very many new ideas out there, like completely new, out of the blue type of ideas. The whole idea behind this is that you can take existing concepts, tweak it, and that in itself is innovation in some ways, right? Because you're building on something that somebody else built, and you're actually doing something. A good example of this is Twitter. Let's think about this. Back in the days of early 1800s, so the 19th century in London, England, somebody had the idea whereby he would create these posts that would sort of exist on various different intersections across the metropolitan city of London at the time. And on these posts would be pencils, and there would be, or writing materials anyway, or a writing pen maybe or whatever, and pieces of paper that were like small, like they were fortune cookie size pieces of paper, right? What you could do is that you could write down a thought and post it on the board, and then other people could read that and see what's going on. Twitter is basically that, right? It's a little bit more personal, but it's really that. So that isn't necessarily a new idea. They just took hold of something that just caught fire, right? They were able to make it personal. They were able to make something that was relevant to the user, and they made it in a way that allowed them to come back over and over again. So a good example of this also was a colleague of mine created an idea where, you have Facebook, and you have something where it's, you have friends and everything else like that. But say, for example, you have an ex-wife. I have a wife that I am very much in love with, so that's not an idea that I have. But for example, if you wanted to avoid somebody, you could call your social network the X Factor, knowing where people you want to avoid are so that you can avoid them. So it's just an example there. But sometimes all you need is a disguise, right? Think about it. Let's take a look at Mortal Kombat, a very popular game that's been around forever. But guess what? It's been around for even longer than you think. Mortal Kombat, really, in essence, is rock, paper, scissors. And the reason why I say that is, think about it. When you're fighting your opponent on Mortal Kombat, the intent behind it is to anticipate the move of your opponent and try to block it, or try to go in for a move that will, cause damage or kill or whatever it is that you want to do. Mortal Kombat is just basically rock, paper, scissors version 2.0 in a lot of ways, with a lot of fancy graphics, right? So sometimes all you need is a disguise. And I think the example around Twitter and the posts in London is a great example of that as well. So not a new concept, but it is something that you can take advantage of. So just bear that in mind. So finally, the design philosophy of great apps isn't that different across any of the mobile platforms. Hopefully that came across in this presentation. One of the things that you need, or the things that you need to keep in mind is amazing apps, apps that people come back to all the time, don't make you think about their user interfaces. They're intuitive, right? They want to come back to your application because they know what to do without even having to open it up the first time, right? Your application may deal with complex tasks, but you should not expose those to the user. Complexity is a deal breaker for users on mobile platforms. You want to make it simple for them to do what they want to do or have fun doing, those types of things. Anything that is complicated should be done in the background or via service or something like that so that they don't have to worry about it, right? The other thing, and this is around microtasking, filling in the white spaces in between larger things such as meetings and everything else like that. Make it easier for users to get their stuff done more quickly. That's really important. And then finally, and this one's the most important, if you can make a user feel awesome in the moment, then you will have a user that's going to be loyal to your application. Now, what do I mean by that? Helping users be awesome in the moment. If you think about games like Rock Band, Dance Central, why are they so popular? It's partly the skill, but really, what is so fun about being able to click a bunch of buttons on a fake guitar and then strum it? It's got nothing to do with that. It's got everything to do with you and your sort of, fantasy to be a rock star singing in front of 50,000 people doing Rock Band Arena, or rock band music, I guess you could say, and things like that, right? So being awesome in the moment, that's how you make users awesome in the moment. Think of apps that, let sports fans call up player stats and stuff like that. That's another way. So, you're at the baseball game, the Blue Jays game, or maybe you're at a hockey game for the Vancouver Canucks or the Montreal Canadiens or whatever it is, right? If you have an application that can bring up stats, you help users be awesome in the moment because of the fact that they're able to provide their friends with some interesting information and things like that, right? So if you can help your users be awesome in the moment, you got it made, right? That is the main goal of any application. So with that, I'll leave it open for Q&A. But before I do that, I'm just going to go to the next slide, which is around, you may have seen this as part of the registration. You can earn your badges and stuff like that for attending some of this session as well as others. But make sure that you go to these links and stuff like that so that you can take a look at various different things that are available. And you can win prizes like phones, Xbox, Connect bundles, all sorts of stuff. So with that, I'm going to see if we can open it up for questions. So I'm just going to go to the question manager. So is it this? Actually, I'll go to control bar and I'll just go to camera right now. Okay. So I'm just taking a look right here if there's any sort of phones and stuff like that. All right, just looking through here. Feel free to ask me the questions if you want. Oh, yeah, sure, will do. Sorry, Fred. Okay, hold on a second here. So, thank you very much, B. Kayams. I appreciate that. Okay. Okay. Also, fill out the form here. So. Okay, so there you go. And I'll actually bring this screen back up for everybody as well so that they can see it. There we go. Oh, probably 2D would be better. Yeah, it's a link above. So just copy and paste those, and then you should be good to go. What do you think about the differences between web apps optimized for mobile version? Yeah, that's a great question. So, Gumavore. It's interesting, right? Because we're starting to see the evolution of HTML through HTML5 and the associated standards and everything else like that. I think it's really interesting because there's kind of two schools of thought. People say, build once, run everywhere, and that's where the aspirations of the web are. And then there's others that say, well, you can't do that and get a great experience if you're not going native and things like that. I think what I told you about here in this presentation, I think, is equally relevant for mobile-only web apps, or web-only mobile apps, I should say, as they are for native apps. The only thing that I think you really need to think about is really what your application does. So if you need things such as location-based data, I know HTML5 does provide that capability, but it's not as fine-tuned as, say, for example, GPS data that you can get through the mobile APIs and things like that over the various platforms. So if you need something that's accurate to within 10 meters or 20 meters, whatever it is, maybe a mobile web app isn't the thing. The other thing that I would say, and this sort of falls in line with the idea of keeping in the spirit of the mobile native mobile platform that you have, is that if you build a web app for mobile, make sure that you skin it appropriately for that mobile platform. So there's nothing worse than going to a Safari site, a site that is mobile web, and seeing a Metro app. Likewise, seeing a iOS app on IE for Windows Phone, for example. Don't do it. It does actually provide a jarring experience, and it's probably not the right thing to do. So hopefully that answered your question. All right, so yeah, that's a great point too. So don't present a mobile experience for tablets because stretched and everything else like that. Totally agree. I think that's the right thing. Yeah, absolutely. So like mobile is kind of a loaded word, right? Because we do have obviously iPad. That was the new one that was announced yesterday and everything. But tablets are becoming very important. Windows 8's coming out, and there's some interesting form factors. I'm sure that will come out with that as well. It is complicating things, and I think it's really important to understand the client that you're dealing with as well, not just the user, right? So I'll admit I have an iPad at home, and there's nothing worse than having to run an iPhone app on the iPad, and likewise, like a iOS or an iPhone web site on the iPad as well, because it gets stretched and ugly and everything else like that. So yeah, great question. Ask NP, or comment, I should say. So I'll be sticking around for another 8 minutes or so, and we'll cut it out by then. So feel free to ask any other questions. Again, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. If you want to ask me other questions offline, feel free to do that. paul.laberge@microsoft.com is the name, and here, you know what, I'll put thanks, and ask MP. Here, I'll put my contact information here, and then I'll put it on at @plaberge is my Twitter handle, and paul.laberge@microsoft.com is my email, and I'm just going to put this on hold on here. There we go. Hopefully that helps. Okay. All right. So I think in around a minute, Fred, our esteemed host of this entire day, and thank you very much, Fred, for allowing me to present. What you can do is he's going to take over in around a minute, and here, I'll take the screen off. How about that? Or the camera off. There we go. Hopefully that helps. And the next presentation will start, but certainly, okay. So the G-Man's got a question. Not sure I understand what I need to do with earn the badge. So I think Rima's on that. So yeah, you're welcome, Shreyans. I appreciate you coming. So Rima, if you don't mind, maybe sort of explaining, or Fred, maybe explaining exactly what they need to do at that link. Unfortunately, I'm not entirely sure myself. Yeah, the developer movement's awesome. So yeah, hold on, just Rima's giving me an instant message here. Yeah, developer movement. So that's the other thing. Good point. So okay, great. Give me a shout. I'd love to know who you actually are, Ask MP. That's awesome. So developer movement. Developermovement.ca or .com. It doesn't really matter. Go to that site if you're interested in building Windows Phone applications, because there's some awesome ideas or awesome opportunities for you. You have to be a Canadian publisher to do it, so just be aware of that. But if you are Canadian and you do want to enter the contest, feel free to do so. Awesome prizes. You can win a Windows Phone for 2 applications. Even for 2 applications, you can choose an Xbox Connect bundle if you want, as well as a number of different other prizes. So definitely take a look at that if you want. Great. So, okay. Stick around for a little bit longer. Excuse me, I just need a drink at the end of that. So as I said, if you're not comfortable asking me a question on this forum and you do want to ask me after the fact, definitely take a look at my email address or Twitter handle. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you, and definitely would be awesome to talk with you, so definitely do that.